Hello. The history of the state of Carthage spans several centuries, and naturally, over time, the organization of the Carthaginian army and its weaponry evolved. It was founded in 814 BC by the Phoenicians. According to legend, the city was founded by Queen Dido, who fled to Africa from Tyre after her husband Sychaeus was killed by her brother, King Pygmalion. The land for founding the city had to be bought from the local tribe, whose leader agreed to sell as much land as could be covered by a bull's hide. Clever Queen Dido cut the bull's hide into thin strips, tied them together, and with the resulting long rope marked out her territory. According to legend, in 814 BC, Dido was compelled to take her own life because the leader of a neighboring tribe desired to marry her and obtain the city as part of her dowry. After her death, an oligarchic republic was established in Carthage. The supreme governing body was the Council of Elders, the Asherat, initially consisting of 10 members, later increased to 30. Originally, these were 10 companions of Dido, followed by their descendants and other aristocrats. The executive authority was led by 2 Suffetes, similar to Roman consuls, elected annually. Legislative power was exercised by a Senate consisting of 300 members. There was also a popular assembly to resolve disputes between the Suffetes and the Senate. In the 8th century BC, Phoenician cities were conquered by Assyria, leading to an influx of refugees into Carthage, which eventually enabled Carthage to establish colonies of its own. Over the centuries, Carthage engaged in numerous wars to defend its position, transforming from a city-state into a major trading empire. Through these wars, Carthage subjugated southern Spain, territories in North Africa, western Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. They also fought against their perennial rivals, the Greek colonies in the western Mediterranean, forming various alliances. Most notably, they engaged in a long war with Syracuse, King Pyrrhus of Epirus, and the famous 3 Punic Wars, culminating in Carthage's complete destruction by the Romans in 146 BC. However, the city was rebuilt decades later and became the capital of the Roman province of Africa. This period, however, falls beyond our narrative, as Carthage became part of the Orbis Romanus. When describing the armed forces of Carthage, I will depart from tradition and begin with a description of the Carthaginian fleet. Carthage was a trading empire, and its main military strength lay in its navy. The Carthaginian navy consisted of large warships propelled by sails and oars used for ramming enemy ships with a bronze ram installed below the waterline at the bow. Direction was controlled by 2 steering oars fixed on either side of the stern. Each oar was equipped with a horizontal spar for steering. Initially, the primary warship was the Trireme, a vessel with 3 rows of oarsmen. Later, quadriremes were used, and from the 4th century BC, the Carthaginian fleet primarily consisted of Quinqueremes. This type of ship also had 3 rows of oars, but while the lower row was managed by 1 oarsman per oar, the middle and upper rows each had 2 oarsmen per oar, totaling 5. The main objective was to ram the enemy ship on its side or stern, or to disable its oars by passing alongside and pulling in with their own oars. Sails were always lowered before battle, and the ships could achieve speeds of 7, 8 knots under oar power. After ramming, the enemy was subjected to projectile fire, followed by potential boarding actions if necessary. Each ship was commanded by 3 officers, one of whom was the helmsman. A Quinqueremes crew consisted of 300 rowers, recruited from Carthaginian citizens and allied cities. In more intense wars, slaves might also be utilized. Additionally, each ship carried a contingent of marines armed with spears, javelins, and swords, capable of capturing enemy vessels. During amphibious operations, rowers could also serve as infantry. The fleet was commanded by an admiral appointed by Carthage's council. The size of the Carthaginian fleet was impressive. According to Polybius, in 256 BC, Carthage had a fleet of 350 ships. Ships were constructed remarkably quickly due to their standardized, numbered parts, facilitating rapid assembly. At the start of the First Punic War, 264-241 BC, the Carthaginian navy held a decisive advantage, prompting Rome to develop a fleet superior to Carthage's and to learn naval warfare. By copying the design of a captured Carthaginian ship and incorporating a new critical element known as the crow, a rotating 11-meter platform with a massive boarding spike resembling a bird's beak, hence the name, the Romans built a fleet of 120 ships in just 2 months in the spring of 260 BC. This innovation nullified Carthaginian naval superiority and transformed naval combat into a form more akin to land warfare, where the Romans had no equals. As a result, in 260 BC, the Romans decisively defeated the Carthaginian fleet at the Battle of Mylae, and after a crushing defeat at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BC, the Carthaginians were compelled to accept harsh terms of peace offered by the Romans. Regarding the army, since Carthage was a trading empire with ample resources, you can easily guess that the main military force consisted of mercenaries. However, there were also units in the Carthaginian army composed of Carthaginian citizens. Let's start with them. The elite of the Carthaginian military was the so-called Sacred Band, numbering up to 2,500 men. It included Carthaginian aristocrats who were considered sacred because of the oath they swore when they were accepted into the ranks of the band. The Sacred Band was easily recognizable on the battlefield as they wore white attire, a color symbolizing death in Carthaginian society. They wore white linen cuirasses adorned with depictions of sunbeams, presumably a symbol of the Sacred Band. Later on, these linen cuirasses were replaced with muscular or scaled breastplates, and eventually with chainmail. Warriors of the Sacred Band were armed with a large hoplite shield, a long spear, and a sword. In battle, they formed a phalanx. Contemporary accounts highlight the excellent training and battlefield resilience of this unit. It's possible that commanders for others' units were recruited from experienced members of the Sacred Band. The second source of troops were allied cities and conquered territories in North Africa, especially ancient Libya and Tunisia. They were led by Carthaginian officers who were paid for their service. The ethnic composition of these units was quite diverse. Firstly, there were the so-called Livo-Phoenicians, residents of Phoenician colonies established by Phoenicians in North Africa. Roman authors, when referring to Hannibal's and Hasdrubal's African infantry, specifically mean these Libio-Phoenicians. In addition, the concept of Libyan or African infantry included a significant number of indigenous Libyans. These were Berber people with their own language, although the Punic language was prevalent among the elite. The Libyan infantry formed a Macedonian-style phalanx, which, if we take Polybius literally, was organized into syntagmas, To clarify, a syntagma, or spera, was the smallest tactical unit of the Macedonian phalanx, consisting of 256 phalangites, 16 rows of 16 warriors. Naturally, the phalangites wielded typical Hellenistic infantry weapons. The sarissa, a short sword, and a round shield with a diameter of 60 centimeters. The African phalanx possessed the same strengths and weak as the Macedonian one, powerful forward momentum, but limited maneuverability in battle. However, Carthaginian commanders were not averse to arming their Libyan infantry differently. For example, Hannibal armed his contingent of Libyans, numbering 12,000, with Roman weapons taken as trophies after victories at Trebia and Lake Trasimene. Nevertheless, the most of the Carthaginian army was primarily composed not of Carthaginian citizens, but of numerous mercenaries arriving from across the Mediterranean, especially from Greece, Iberia, Gaul, and other regions. Among them, it is worth noting the Numidian cavalry, who should be regarded more as allies of the Carthaginians rather than mercenaries. The Numidians were nomadic tribes inhabiting the territories of modern-day Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Before the camel spread in North Africa, the lifestyle of these nomadic tribes was entirely dependent on horses, and all warriors were born riders, spending most of their lives on horseback from a young age. Excellent horsemen, the Numidians did not use saddles or bridles, instead controlling their horses with their legs and voice, using a leather strap or rope thrown over the horse's neck instead of a bridle. Their armament consisted of throwing spears and a large shield made of leather on a wooden base, which could be replaced by a simple animal skin wrapped around the arm. For close combat, they used large knives or daggers. Many of them entered battle with two horses and were skilled at switching from a tired horse to a fresh one in the heat of battle. Distinctive features of Numidian appearance included tunics with wide hems worn without a belt, used as cloaks and armor made from animal skins, as well as braided hair and beards. Numidian cavalry were typically tasked with provoking the enemy into a counterattack, luring them into an ambush with feigned retreats, forcing them to abandon advantageous positions, or preemptively seizing strategic points. They were employed for reconnaissance, ambushes, and led the vanguard of the army, harassing enemy foragers. They were also entrusted with raiding enemy territories, pursuing defeated foes, and capturing prisoners. In almost all wars of Carthage, Balearic slingers took part. They were renowned for their high combat skills, accuracy, and the weight of the projectiles they used throughout the Mediterranean. Training in the art of slinging started from early childhood. Mothers would place bread on a pole and encourage their children to knock it down. The learner would not receive food until they hit the bread. Warriors carried 3 slings, in hand, wrapped around the head, and as a belt. According to Strabo, these slings could be made from rope made of reeds, hair, or animal sinews. They hurled stones from the slings larger than those of any other slingers, or specially made elongated projectiles of baked clay or lead. Slingers fought in the front lines of Carthaginian forces. Their task was to disrupt the enemy ranks. The kinetic energy of their projectiles was sufficient to shatter a shield or inflict a serious injury on an armored enemy warrior. When the enemy approached, or they ran out of projectiles, slingers withdrew behind the heavy infantry formations. During sieges, they were capable of destroying warriors positioned on walls. Almost always among mercenaries were inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula. The term Spaniards united peoples and tribes of different origins: Iberians, Lusitanians, Celtiberians, and Celts. Spanish infantry consisted of two categories of warriors: swordsmen, armed with swords and long Celtic-type shields, as well as dart throwers. The length of the sword reached 60 centimeters, with a width of 7 centimeters. In fact, Romans borrowed this type of sword from the Spaniards, which we know as the gladius. A distinctly Spanish weapon was the long, over 2 meters, solid iron throwing spear with a serrated tip called a soliferium, or saunion. Warriors wore white tunics bordered with a purple stripe, and alongside helmets, a distinctive headgear made from animal sinews. The favored weapon of the cavalry was the falcata, an curved, single-edged slashing and stabbing sword, likely borrowed from the Phoenicians. Likely in the 4th century BC, Celtiberians introduced the horseshoe into use, significantly enhancing the combat potential of these troops. When necessary, Spanish cavalry could dismount, transforming into first-rate infantry, and also fight in mixed formations alongside light infantry. According to ancient sources, Spanish cavalry dominated the battlefields during the Punic Wars era. Neither Roman and Italian cavalry, nor even Numidians, who switched sides to the Romans, could withstand them. For the war against Rome, the Carthaginians hired quite a few Gauls into their army. Gauls served both in infantry and cavalry. Of enormous stature, immense strength, with hairy bodies and colorful clothing, wielding long, heavy swords, and charging into battle with wild shouts, they threw themselves into combat with such furious intensity that no one could withstand their initial onslaught. However, in prolonged combat, they quickly tired and became disorganized. Strabo described the appearance of Gallic infantrymen as follows. Gallic weaponry corresponds to their great stature, a long sword hanging on their right side, and a mandaris dart. Celtic shields typically had an oval or elongated hexagonal shape, made from thin oak or lime boards and covered with leather. This resulted in a construction that was simultaneously light and resilient, which the warrior held using a central horizontal handle, using the shield not only for defense, but also as an offensive weapon to strike their opponent. The primary weapon of Gallic cavalry was the lancia, a spear up to 2.5 meters long with a leaf-shaped tip. In addition to this, cavalrymen used the long Gallic sword. Naturally, the Carthaginians also hired Greek hoplites, who formed the traditional phalanx. The description of ancient Greek warriors I placed in the video, The Army and Weapons of Ancient Greece. Alongside the obvious advantages of using mercenaries, there were significant drawbacks. Any delay in payment caused complaints, and in 240 BC, mercenaries rebelled. Carthage's war with the mercenaries lasted for 3 years and shook the foundations of the state. By the way, Gustave Flaubert vividly described this rebellion in his novel Salammbô. Traditionally, for a long time, the Carthaginians used war chariots in battle, an experience they brought from the Near East, with an extremely high concentration of chariots. For instance, in the Battle of Tunis, observers counted 2,000 chariots in the Carthaginian army. However, chariots were used alongside cavalry to engage in battle, playing a supporting role. Their attacks were not supported by infantry. According to Plutarch, Carthaginian chariots were drawn by a team of 4 horses. However, after the war with Pyrrhus, the Carthaginians permanently abandoned the use of chariots and began employing war elephants instead. Since then, elephants played an important tactical role in the Carthaginian army. They struck terror into soldiers who had never seen elephants before, and horses, rendering cavalry units ineffective. They covered their infantry and, with a successful attack, could break through the enemy army's front lines. However, elephants were unpredictable in battle and could inflict as much harm to their own side as to the enemy. Moreover, well-organized armies like the Romans quickly learned to combat elephants, significantly reducing their effectiveness. Elephants were not bred in captivity, but captured from the wild, aiming to catch young ones no older than 5 years. Training of elephants started when they were 10 years old. Elephants reached full maturity by the age of 20, and their working life spanned from 20 to 40 years. Carthaginians utilized the now extinct subspecies of savanna elephant, the North African or Carthaginian elephant, which was smaller than other African and Asian elephants, reaching a height of 2.5 meters. Carthaginians rode them like horses without using a tower, a structure for housing fighters widely used by other Eastern armies. That concludes my story. Goodbye.